Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming today. My name is Dreher. I'm with the Danube Institute here in Budapest, and it's my great pleasure to welcome here to Budapest my friend Mary Harrington from the UK. She's the author of a book and a concept about reactionary feminism. What was the title of the book?
Feminism Against Progress.
Feminism Against Progress. Well, when you hear the term reactionary feminism, that's Mary, and it's a fascinating book, and we're going to talk a little bit about Mary's ideas today. And I want you to save some questions, because I know that many of you will have questions, and we'll save some time at the end for them. But Mary, I think we should start by asking you, what is a reactionary feminist as opposed to a regular feminist?
Well, I mean, reactionary feminism actually started as a joke, in the sense that I had a very long-running argument with a friend, all in internet messaging, where he said that it was not possible to be a post-liberal feminist or a post-liberal anything, because post-liberal had no meaning, and I should call myself a reactionary. And I said, excuse me, what? And we went back and forth, and eventually we had this long argument about whether I should call myself post-liberal or reactionary. And eventually I conceded the point. I was like, okay, fine, I'll change my name to reactionary feminist. So I changed my Twitter bio just to see what would happen, and just because then it didn't mean I would have to admit that that I'd lost the argument. So I just changed my bio to see how long it would take him to notice. It took about 4 days, I think. But in the meantime, a magazine editor wrote to me and said, "This is an interesting idea. What is a reactionary feminist? Would you like to write about it?" And I said, "Ooh, I better figure out what I mean." So I sort of had to work it out backwards. What do I mean by reactionary feminist? And I think the short answer is it was a question, really. Is it possible to be a feminist if you don't believe in progress? Because I don't believe in progress, and I realized in my late 20s, I'm 45 now, and I realized in my late 20s, I suppose, that I no longer believed in progress. And how I got there is a very long story.
Well, progress, what do you mean by progress?
So by progress, I mean, well, it's an idea which I think you find in the air, really, these days. You could call it a sort of secularized version of the Christian understanding of history, which says that we're coming from somewhere, that history has a beginning, and it has a whole load of stuff in the middle, lots of which is good and lots of which is bad. But it's going to somewhere, and it will end somewhere, and that the end point will probably be better than whatever it is we have now. Maybe all our problems will go away in some sort of final.
The arc of history is long,
but it bends towards justice, exactly. And the idea, and progress or progressivism is essentially that Christian eschatology, but with all of the transcendental stuff taken out, all of the religious elements that say death, judgment, heaven, hell, everything. We don't need to worry about the life beyond, we don't need to worry about the soul, we don't have to believe in any of that stuff, but we're going from somewhere to somewhere, and the to is probably better than the from.
Side note.
And I don't believe in that. I don't believe it's a thing.
Milan Kundera, the Czech novelist who went into exile from communism, said in his novel The Unbearable Lightness of Being that what makes a leftist or a progressive is the belief in the grand march of history, as you've just said. But what makes them particularly progressive is that they can fold any possible cause into the grand march, hence Queers for Palestine.
Just so. I call that the omni-cause. And it just goes along, sort of mopping up bits and pieces along the way.
Right. So what happened to you?
So what happened to me, I mean, when I realized I no longer believed in progress, this left me with a real dilemma. Because I've always thought of myself as a feminist, ever since I was about 13, and I realized that I was expected to help clear the table after dinner and my brothers weren't, and this felt really unfair. Because I'd always been led to believe, by both of my parents actually, that I was in every respect, meaningfully equal to my brothers. And I felt that this ought to be fair, because why not? Why should things be different for them than for me? And yet, when my dad got up to leave the table, he would just leave all the dishes on the table. And after a while, my brothers would start to copy him. And that left me with a real dilemma. There I am, 13 years old, and I'm thinking, well, this is unfair. So if I have equal standing with my brothers, I should be able to just leave the table and leave my mum to clear up. But that seems really unfair on my mum's. If I feel some solidarity with the other woman, the other female in the household, I feel like I ought to help her. But this also feels unfair on all of us. And I mean, I didn't have any very coherent thoughts about that when I was 13, but it made me angry. It felt unfair. It felt like a deep and an intractable dilemma.
So what did you do?
So I started reading Simone de Beauvoir, and then I got steadily angrier and more postmodern over the course of my late teens and early 20s. I encountered critical theory at university. I met Judith Butler, and her ideas that we can perform our way into any gender that we like. By the time I left university, I was fairly thoroughly marinated in critical theory and queer theory and had embraced all of those things. I wanted to be able to explore and experiment with and construct my own identity along any lines I desired. I felt like my body should be no impediment to doing any of that.
Because that's progress.
Because that's progress. To be liberated from the constraints of literally anything is part and parcel of where it felt as though progress had brought us to. I mean, you have to remember this is more than 20 years ago that all of this was going on. The late 1990s and the early noughties were really the point that I think of as peak progress. That was the point where it felt like history really had ended. I don't know how it felt in Hungary at the time, but in England, after the end of the Cold War, after the Berlin Wall came down, and from that point up to really 9/11 and then the global financial crash, there was this strange interlude where it really did feel, if you were in a wealthy part of the developed world, that history had ended, and that from there on in it was just going to be incremental progress towards more shopping, more consumerism, and more individual freedom. And it honestly, I mean, it doesn't feel like that anymore. My goodness.
Oh no, it doesn't.
Oh my word, no, it really doesn't feel like that anymore. But that's where I was coming from, and that's where I was when I was young, and where my sense of what progress is was formed. That all fell apart for me, I guess, in the year of the global financial crash. It all still just about felt possible after 9/11. I was young then and in my 20s and leading a very experimental, very bohemian lifestyle in London. I lived in house shares. I went and lived in communes in America for a little while. I changed my name to Sebastian for a while to see how that felt. I realized I didn't want to. I didn't want male pronouns, although one or two people did ask me very solemnly if I wanted to be referred to as he, and no, that didn't feel. Anyway, and then I changed my name to Sebastian Mary because it was kind of a thought experiment. So I was sort of playing with self-presentation and gender in all sorts of ways which are now very rigidly codified in the kind of woke culture that's taken over the world, and really sincerely trying to live the dream and I mean it fell apart for me just because I realized that it just wasn't very nice and I wasn't enjoying it and I wasn't in any sort of meaningful personal way making progress. Well, I was living hand to mouth. There I was at age 28, and I didn't have a partner, I didn't have a home, I was living hand to mouth. And then the business that I co-founded, fell apart underneath me, and I lost my whole social circle and everything which made my life meaningful. And I just, and I pretty much started again from nothing and reevaluated everything that I believed, which had got me up to that point.
Well, and as you've written, you found that so many of these progressives were actually quite nasty people who didn't get along at all.
Yeah, I think that was probably the most formative aspect of it for me. Living in radically anti-hierarchical communes, you realize if you're paying attention, it becomes clear over time that power dynamics don't go away just because everyone's formally repudiated power dynamics. All that happens is that conceals them and makes them tacit and implicit. So you're living in a community where, in theory, the structure is flat and everybody decides things consensually. All that means is that the actual power dynamics are hidden. And the same if you found a company that's nominally flat structured and everybody decides things in a fairly non-hierarchical way. All that happens is the actual hierarchy is concealed. And this, I think, was probably the most shattering lesson for me. I mean, if this feels like a long way around to get to feminism, it's not. This all has a material bearing on how I came to be both a reactionary and a feminist. But I think that was really the most formative lesson, that you cannot escape power. You cannot escape interpersonal conflict. You cannot escape. And really, very fundamentally as well, what came out of all of that for me, is that you cannot escape your body. So power, interpersonal tensions and embodiment came through to me at the end of that very sort of experimental, very idealistic, very anti-materialist 10 years or so of my late teens and early 20s as the irreducible facts of being in this world. The things that you just cannot get away from, however you choose to rationalize them. And so by the time I'd formed some kind of a coherent, rebuilt some sort of worldview out of the rubble of losing my faith in progress, I think I was in my mid-30s. I'd left London. I'd decided I was just going to be normal for a bit. I was going to, having tried my best to be unconventional in every way, and decided that was just horrible. I was going to do my best to be normal.
How radical.
Well, as it turns out, Rod, you can, if you're a bit eccentric, that doesn't go away just because you try and be normal. It just means you pass better. It just means you can be stealthier about it. And actually, I recommend that to anybody who's mildly eccentric. Just try and look normal. It makes life a lot easier all around. But yeah, by the time I was in my mid-30s, I'm living in the countryside. I'm married. Doing my best to be. I've got a normal job. I've retrained as a psychotherapist, and then I had a baby. And that really is the point where you realize as a woman that you can't escape your body, and that you can't escape asymmetries in power and asymmetries in capacity and asymmetries in relationships. And it left me, it left me with a lot of time to think, because there I am pushing a buggy around the streets of small-town England with a baby and a whole load of new, very literally visceral, embodied experiences of this incredibly intimate and beautiful new relationship with a tiny baby who I'm responsible for looking after. And I'm thinking, okay, so I don't believe in progress, but I still think that women's interests matter, and they're not always the same as those of men, and they're often, and point four, they're often undervalued. They're often the interests of women are often sidelined. In fact, I came to realise, as a mum pushing a child around the streets of small-town England, that not only are women's interests often undervalued, they're very often undervalued by the same women who claim to be promoting women's interests. Because here I am as a mum, and I'm experiencing a whole load of things which have just been completely invisible to me in almost the entirety of the popular feminist reading I'd done up to that point. And I realised that the liberal feminism I'd grown up with, and which I'd always taken for granted was really the truth of what ought to be the good for me as a woman, had just had a total blind spot, an almost complete blind spot, where mothers were concerned. And I thought, well, this doesn't make sense. Being a mother is pretty much by definition, an important part of being a woman. The majority of women are mothers. The majority of women want children. I mean, okay, some don't, that's fine, you do you. But the majority of women do, and the majority of women do become mothers. How is it that we're all not in this picture? Or at best, how is it in this picture that motherhood is just a problem to be solved? A set of unfair asymmetries which are imposed on women. How is it that we don't make more space for this? And I read a little bit more, and I realized that motherhood is there in feminism, but somehow, in fact, so much so, there have always been feminists. So the second wave, the first wave, and I won't give you the whole history of it, but all the way. But there have always been feminists wanting to make the case for mothers, and they're always sidelined. And I was thinking, why is this? Why is motherhood always the poor relation? Why is maternal feminism? Oh, and thereby, and so the answers to all the long answer to all of these questions turned into the book, Feminism Against Progress. And the answer to the question, can you be a feminist if you don't believe in progress, is yes, but it depends a little bit on what you mean by feminism, and it depends a little on what you mean by progress, but I think we've defined that, but also a little on what you believe, what you mean by feminism. And the answer to the question, why is it that maternal feminism has always ended up as the poor relation, is very much bound up in the story of the women's movement, which I came to realize as I studied and I thought. And I did most of this thinking while my daughter was very young and interwoven with caring for her and watching her grow up. She's 7 now. I came to realize that you can see the history of feminism as a history of ideas or of ideology, but you can also see it as a material, as a concrete, practical history of men and women having to change, or really women's response to the way the Industrial Revolution and everything which has come since the Industrial Revolution has transformed family life, and which in the book, as I've set it out, has followed, well, in the early history it took two characteristic forms, from women's point of view, the most important change that came with the Industrial Revolution was that work left the home, which created a whole new set of dilemmas for women, which we now just assume that everybody has to deal with, balancing work and home. But there was a time when work and home were the same thing, and essentially subsistence or artisan economies, where men and women all worked, but men's work and women's work were different, and women's work included the care of children, along with various other other activities around the home. But the central economic unit was the productive household. And then industrialization comes along, and first it takes men out of the home into factories and offices, and then eventually, it takes working class women out of the home into further factories, and all of these women are left with the dilemma of what's left of our role, what's left of family life, and how are we if we're going to be, and how are we going to care for the children? So typically, where women could afford to, they exited economic life and became private citizens in a private household, if you like, the sort of bourgeois housewife model, which everyone now calls traditional motherhood, but is in fact distinctively modern. That's an important point from what conservatives frame as the traditional gender roles are in fact distinctively modern and particular to the industrial era. And this is fine as far as it goes. Oh, up a bit. Okay, can you hear me better? I'm sorry. So I've lost.
We were talking about what conservatives define as traditional gender roles, and this raises a good question. What's the difference between conservatism and reaction? You're a reactionary feminist, not a conservative feminist, and I imagine a lot of people may not appreciate the distinction.
When people ask me that question, I tend to quote Nicolas Gomez Davila at them, a Colombian aphorist, a very, very beautiful writer I recommend to all of you. One of his aphorisms, roughly translated, as the reactionary only becomes conservative in ages that admit of something worth conserving.
So you think we've blown it, that there's not a lot worth conserving?
Well, no, but secondly, the true reactionary, Davila says, is not a seeker after abolished pasts, but a hunter of sacred shades on the eternal hills.
Wait, say that again.
He is not a seeker after abolished pasts, but a hunter of sacred shades on the eternal hills. So I would say the difference between a conservative and a reactionary is the difference between somebody who's trying to conserve or restore something which actually you can't have back. And I would argue that we can't, in fact, have quote-unquote traditional gender roles back, because traditional gender roles came out of a set of material conditions which no longer apply. We no longer live in the industrial era. I mean, I don't know how things are in Hungary, but in England we don't really have mass manufacturing anymore. And as such, wanting to go back to a set of family patterns and family organizations which emerged in order to respond to those material conditions simply doesn't make sense. And actually what we need to understand is what are the eternal verities of living together as men and women and families. To the best of our understanding, what can we infer about what's eternally true of living together and forming families and living well together, and how can we adapt those verities to the world we live in now? And I would say that I think is probably the core of what I would call reactionary feminism, which is to say we start from the basis that men and women exist. And we start from the basis that forming families is good. We start from the basis that actually men and women generally do want to love one another and live well together and form families and have children and form and build the wider social fabric from those basic units, and that those things are good. But there's a certain amount of conflict and competing interests involved in figuring out the best way to do that. So let's try and work constructively with what we have there.
So Mary, what are some of the main obstacles to the reactionary feminist program, both from the conventional left and from the right? And I'm thinking from the right, I'm thinking about consumerism, that sort of thing. But what do you say?
So from the left, I have a certain number of criticism that comes to me from those liberal feminists who would prefer to go on pretending that men and women are not different, where the reality is that as far as anyone with eyes and a functioning brain can see, men and women exist. we're not quite the same. We're similar in a great many ways. We're equally capable of excellence. We're equally deserving of dignity and good treatment, but we're not quite the same. And certainly where it comes to family life, there are some things which are just irreducibly different. Only women can have children. Only women can breastfeed. Physiologically, we're not the same. Men are stronger. Men are typically more aggressive, etc. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you're familiar with the normative differences, and I'm sure you're all capable of understanding a normative distribution and the fact that there are outliers on all of these.
Well, yeah, and here in Hungary, they still can tell you what a woman is and what a man is.
That's it. It's not like being in New York City where you have to watch where you are when you say out loud that only women can breastfeed.
So that's the left.
So the left. That there are liberal feminists who would cheerfully see males who say they're women added to a women's prison. Because otherwise, to say otherwise would mean admitting that there are some circumstances in which men and women really aren't the same, and it's in their larger economic and political interests to assert that men and women are interchangeable in every possible way, because there are some elite professional women for whom claiming otherwise would not serve their economic and professional interests.
So what about from the right? What do you see the anti-feminist, in the good sense of feminism?
Yeah, just to complete the thought, on the left there are some radical feminists who would accuse me of carrying water for the reactionary right, in the sense that they worry that noticing that most people still value family and advocating for marriage, advocating for lifelong solidarity, and holding, as I do, a moderately critical stance towards the role of abortion and birth control in the wider social fabric, which I see as it's complicated, but in summary, I think it's a bad metaphysic, and I think it's anti and is intricately bound up in why motherhood and caring has chronically played a second-class role certainly in feminism since the second wave. And very simply, if your idea of existing as a person, if your idea of the feminist defense, if your feminism is predicated on the idea that personhood as such is only accessible to women to the extent that we're able to destroy a potential life that we host in our own bodies, then it's difficult. Wherever you stand on abortion, I don't know where you all are on abortion, but it's hard to see how that could not leave our caring obligations as second class, how that could not frame those caring obligations that women and the specific capacities and joys of motherhood as more likely to be a threat, more likely to be a burden, and if you like, a structural handicap to women's being able to exist as person in the liberal sense, right. Because it's always potentially an encumbrance. It's always potentially.
Here's an interesting point. You and I were talking about it earlier about the difference between feminism in the U.S. and in the U.K. Around the transgender issue. In the U.S., the pro-life side, the anti-abortion side, has been deeply tied to the Catholic Church and to religion. But you yourself, I don't know where you stand today, but when we've talked about religion in the past, I don't know if you would have described yourself as a religious believer, but you did arrive at a pro-life position otherwise. Am I correct about that? I don't want to put you in a position of talking about something you don't want to talk about, but...
Okay, how do I best frame this? I would not would I describe myself as a pro-lifer? I think I would say I'm pro-babies, very pure and simple. I'm pro-babies, and I'm pro-everything. I'm pro-any policy and every policy that increases the possibility that every baby will be welcome in conjunction with his or her mother, where that doesn't come at the expense of his or her mother's ability to be a person. And to me, that is the absolute nuclear core of reactionary feminism. To say, does this policy Does this program, does this idea, does this vision make it more likely that we can welcome every child without that coming at the expense of his or her mother? And if the answer to that is no, it's not reactionary feminism. But that's pretty broad, and it's pretty contextual, and it's going to vary a great deal depending on your local cultural context. And it's a stance which makes it just as possible to critique the right, really, as the left, because there are plenty of right-wing policies which will make it more possible for a baby to be welcomed, but in a way which will come at the expense of his or her mother. And really, that's where, in as much as I have critics on the right, they tend to dislike. Well, they like the reactionary, but they don't like the feminism. They like the advocacy for motherhood and family, but they don't like the idea that women exist and are people. Yeah, I think there are. My bar for what constitutes misogyny is very high relative to your average liberal feminist, who might see a sort of a throwaway sexist remark as misogynistic, where I don't really care. And I certainly don't care what men say amongst themselves when I'm not around. But my metric for whether something counts as misogyny is, does this person think women are people? And you meet those, more men than women, but not universally men. You meet people. You meet those men who genuinely just don't see women as people on both sides of the political spectrum. I mean, you find them on the left where you see men who really just don't care if all the female athletic victories on the planet are swept away, if one man who says he's a woman can feel validated in his transgender identification. They don't care. You know, women should just try harder, or maybe, you know, women should just be kinder. And there are plenty of men on the left who will shrug their shoulders. And the only inference I can come to is that they just don't think women are people. And then you see the same thing on the right, the same indifference to
Andrew Tate.
Well, I really don't want to get onto the Andrew Tate territory. We'll be here all afternoon. But you see it on the right, where you see these advocacy for traditional gender roles, where it literally doesn't matter how terribly the man behaves. It's still somehow the woman's fault. Even if he beats her, or even if he murders her, maybe she should have just picked better. You know, as though women are simultaneously responsible for everything, simultaneously omniscient, and also not people.
I think that's something that younger people today who see the complete mess that the women's movement or feminism has made of family life and male-female relations, they may forget, they never knew, because they didn't live through what it was like prior to the women's movement. And when you talk to people of like my grandmother's generation, none of them are liberals, but they all will tell stories about how much they had to struggle, how much they had no choice but to live with husbands who beat them because there was nothing for them. You know, and I think that's something that we need to keep in mind, even as we criticize the excesses of the women's movement.
Absolutely. One of the most interesting conversations I've had recently was with Lauren Southern, who's a Canadian, I suppose, a Canadian conservative anti-immigration activist. She was a very significant figure in the alt-right after the election of Donald Trump, and who told me, she spoke to me about her story of getting married to a man and doing her level best to lead a trad life along the lines laid out by the modern internet right, I think you should probably say, and how it went wrong for her and how hard she tried to make it work, because she believed that women were solely responsible for how well a marriage went. She believed that men could essentially do no wrong, because this was the ideology that she'd internalized, and he moved her thousands of miles from friends and family. He verbally abused her. He made her do all the work. He would disappear for days at a time. I mean, I don't know his side of the story, but I don't think I need to hear his side of the story to think there was something not good happening here. And she's come out the other end, and the point that she made to me was, I did my best to lead, to embrace this very abstract, very rigid internet ideology and to live by it, and it just wasn't enough. Life is more complicated than that. Relationships are more complicated than that, and actually, internet ideologies are just never enough. And it seems to me that actually what we need more than anything is more relationships in the real world, particularly more relationships with and more opportunity to learn from older people. And actually, I'm coming increasingly to think, especially as I get older, that one of the most essential missing components is the benevolent surveillance of younger people by older women, particularly older married women. I mean,
mentorship?
Yeah, mentorship, and just being able to keep an eye and say, you know, I went there once and that wasn't great. And to be able to have a thicker and slightly more deeply woven social fabric. So this feels to me as though it's profoundly missing, and I'm honestly not sure how we go about repairing that, except one step at a time and one relationship at a time.
Well, that's a good segue to the last question I want to ask you before we turn to the audience. I've been living here in Hungary for 3 years, and it's clearly a Western country, but it is more conservative generally on gender roles, and that causes some friction. You know, when I talk to my younger friends, both female and male, they're struggling with dating and with trying to find another partner. But things are, if you believe in progress, and you don't, things are farther behind here than they are the UK and the US, and I think that's a good thing. But what advice would you give to Hungarians, to the people here in this audience, men and women, about how they can avoid the mistakes that feminists made in the UK, the US, and the West?
Thing number one is, whatever you do, don't believe the lie that men and women are interchangeable. You know, because it's not true. It's not true, and it will never be true. It doesn't matter how much technology we throw at the problem. It's never going to be true that men and women can be made completely interchangeable. And that opens out into a wider point, I guess, which is if our bodies matter, and being grounded in our bodies and the specificity of our sex bodies matters, so too does being grounded in the physical world. I mean, this is the internet meme, is go outside. But it really is, it bears repeating again and again, go outside. You know, make friends in real life. Don't just sit there scrolling. You know, have hobbies in the real world. Go to church. If you don't want to go to church, go join clubs. Whether that's going to lead you to finding a partner, I don't know. But go out in the real world. Be in the real world. Exist in the physical world. Don't let yourself be drawn away into the dematerialized land of the internet, because it will fill you with lies, and it will fill you with beliefs which simply don't map in any meaningful or helpful or life-giving way onto reality, as Paul Laurence Southern found out, and a great many other people are still finding out the hard way. And honestly, I learned the hard way as well, that these very abstract ideologies simply don't offer enough to make sense of the complexity of real life. Go outside. Stay outside. Whatever you do, don't let yourself be sucked as far into this world of abstraction as the Anglosphere has become. You know, stay in the real world, stay in your local area, stay in reality.
Move into your right brain more than your left brain.
Yeah. I mean, I'm about as chronically online as it's possible to be for my sins. I guess it's my hobby.
Hold my beer.
Okay, but I very intentionally do as much long-distance running as I can, very simply because it's impossible to scroll and run a 10K at the same time. You can't do it. And I need that time to come back into my physical self, you know, to be out in the fresh air, to be in the real world. And it sounds so mundane to say it, but you need, you know, whether it's long-distance running or some sort of intense physical practice like lifting weights or Ashtanga yoga or, I don't know, whatever it is that works for you, you have to have something like that. Otherwise, you just disappear into this world of abstraction the whole time. And you know, having kids brings you down into your physical self. I do some of my best thinking when I'm cleaning the house. You know, this all sounds incredibly mundane, but these are the times when ideology has to give way to whatever it is that's right in front of you. And if there's something I would say, a central principle I would say to take from, you know, the mistakes that the liberal feminists have made in the West, it's that you can't abstract away what's right in front of us, and we can't abstract away the realities of our bodies.
Yeah. Any other advice for young men?
Well, I'm not a young man, so it's sort of hard. Actually, I do have some advice for young men, especially you. Get offline. There is nothing more emasculating than spending all of your time posting. Get offline. Go hang out with each other in real life. And hang out with each other away from women, but do it in real life, not on the internet.
So let's turn to the audience. I'm sure some of you have questions. Anybody? Yes, please stand and speak loud so everybody can hear. Here, I'll come to you with the... All right, okay.
Thank you. So this question, well, first of all, I hope it will be relevant to the topic. This question has been eating at me for a few months now. I saw a lot of videos and blog posts about actually young women antagonizing and being very, very hostile against, you know, young men, and then making them kind of like the enemy of the whole feminist movement, and that, you know, saying things like you are a part of the patriarchy and things like that, and they are so young teenagers, they really don't have anything to do with it. Can you maybe explain why this is, or why this idea of antagonizing these young males, these or men in their 20s?
Honestly, clickbait. You know, it's the internet.
Clickbait.
Clickbait. To explain what I mean by that, it's internet content of the kind which is designed to arouse strong feelings, provoke a reaction, and encourage more views. You know, all the incentives of social media are towards ever more crude, ever more hostile, ever more antagonistic and unpleasant material, you know, delivered as quickly as possible in order to get a reaction and in order to provoke a response. And it really is a race to the bottom. Actually, when I spoke to Lauren, she made the same point about the manosphere, with the red pill, which she says over her adult life has gone from offering instructions to men on how to manipulate women into providing sexual access, to just saying women are disgusting and hateful and you shouldn't have relationships with them at all. Essentially because that's an easier and quicker sell. It just takes less time to produce a video that says women are hateful, leave them alone. And that's just where the discourse has got to now. I mean, I don't know what the logical endpoint to this is, but honestly, so much of it, you know, this is why I say go outside. You know, talk to people in real life, talk to women, you know, talk to the opposite sex in real life, you know, go hang out with people, and you realize that actually none of this is true, you know. And when you think about your brothers and your sisters and your friends and, you know, everybody in your peer groups in class, it's not true. None of it is true, and this stuff is just there on the internet, poisoning people's brains. And the best cure for it is just go outside. Yeah. It's easier said than done, but really, just go outside.
Well, and I have to say too that I know a number of men, some of whom are close to me, close friends, who have been through very bad marriages. They've been emotionally and psychologically abused by the women they've been married to. And part of what's encouraged that is the women have bought into, even if they're conservative, you know, vote conservative, they bought into this idea that you only live once and that my husband is holding me down. You know, I know a friend of mine in Alabama, for example, his wife was part of a group of women friends, one of whom got a divorce you only live once, so she can live her best life. 4 others within the group also got divorces, not because the men were abusive or alcoholic or anything like that, just because they wanted to be free. They bought into this individual liberty idea, which I think is not necessarily a liberal idea, you know, a left-wing idea, but so it's problematic, and but there was nothing in the culture, in popular culture, at least in the U.S., that would shame the woman and say you can't behave that way. That's not fair, because the man, at least in the media and in pop culture, always has to be wrong.
Yeah, and I think the incentives in the wider culture, and particularly as it's propagated on the internet, are towards ever more fragmentation, you know, as a way of releasing more energy for individual self-gratification. And I mean, we could go back and forth over who's the greater sinner, the men or the women. And honestly, I think it probably cashes out about even.
Yeah, no.
Overall, honestly, I wish I had better answers for how we can start rebuilding solidarity. But I think the starting point has to be right wherever you happen to be. The starting point has to be doing what's in front of you and treasuring the relationships that are in front of you. You know, where those relationships are abusive, then obviously you don't treasure those. You know, if you're in a situation where you're unsafe or life is truly terrible, then you need to be somewhere else. But there are a great many more relationships which are just a bit meh. And those, particularly where children are involved, I salute the people who stick with them.
Yeah, I mean, you can't make the perfect the enemy of the good.
Just so. And I think there's, especially where you're surrounded by consumerist ideologies that tell you that everything can be good or great or perfect because look at this person on Instagram, aren't they so happy? And then you're also surrounded by, the movie culture of, I must go off and find myself and life will be better on the other side. The aggregate effect is to say, wherever something isn't perfect, then I can leave and I'll find something better somewhere else. And often that just isn't true. I mean, I forget the exact statistic on what proportion of people, sort of more ambiguous divorces end up regretting their decision to divorce. I know a couple of couples who got divorced and then later remarried again because they realised life wasn't actually better outside the marriage. Life is long, it has seasons. People's lives are often messy, people often don't make sense. Sometimes you just have to do the job that's in front of you, and I think that's particularly important where there are children in the picture.
Yeah, one of the quotes that I like to live by, and I think it's so wise, is what Alexander Solzhenitsyn, of all people, said he learned from being in the Gulag under communism, that the line between good and evil does not pass between races or social classes, or he might have said between men and women. It passes right down the middle of every human heart. And that's wisdom. We've gotten to the last minutes here. We haven't even talked about pornography. I know we have 3 minutes, so we can't.
Can't do.
But I just want to say that this is something that my generation and yours never really had to deal with. Widespread internet pornography and how that poisons the relationships between men and women. What do reactionary feminists have to say about pornography?
I mean, very central to my feminism is a critique of technology, in the sense that it always both liberates us and then it also finds ways to capture us and to make us dependent on a technology. And I think that when we look at the question, the challenge of pornography, we really do have to look at it through a technological lens, because obscene or titillating material has always been with us. I mean, there's pornography going back very long time, and really if something has changed, it's smartphones. It's the sheer volume and the ease of access and the addictiveness of scrolling through these devices. And there's very robust evidence at this point that the sheer volume of consumption and the addictiveness is having long-term damaging effects, particularly on children who encounter these sometimes very disturbing images at a very young age. In a context where, again, for clickbait reasons, because there's a competition for attention, the images themselves are becoming more and more extreme and disturbing, and that this really is shaping children. It's propagating violence, it's creating interpersonal problems, or even just leaving young men and women in a situation where they no longer have experience desires for one another, or for anything at all, really. And fundamentally, what's changed is smartphones. I think something like 80% of Pornhub access is via smartphones, and that's not really surprising when you think about it. Why would you want someone checking your browser history on a laptop when you can just scroll it on your phone where nobody else can see? And I think we can go some distance towards mitigating this with a technological solution to what is fundamentally a technological problem. There are states in the US where just imposing age verification has caused Pornhub to exit granting access in that state altogether, because really what they're admitting tacitly is that a vast proportion of the people who are accessing their website are children. They don't want to come out and say it, but it's true. actually, well, who's scrolling Pornhub on their phone is kids. And once they introduce age verification, the problem doesn't exactly go away, but Pornhub goes away. And I think, no, you probably can't eliminate it altogether. And then the libertarians among us would probably say you don't want to, and free speech and yada, yada, yada. But I think you can, and I think we can, and that we should suppress it as vigorously as possible, for the simple reason that even if a certain amount of obscene material is still available, we can't have the formative sexual imagery that is encountered by the majority of children being... I'm not even going to say some of the things that but we can't have it. We can't have that.
No, we can't. And
it's civilization ending, honestly.
Well, and to wrap up, it sounds like that your overall prescription would be that in order for men and women to be able to live together and thrive and form families, we need to drop a lot of the narratives that have been guiding our public life and our private lives for a long time. Not just on the left, but also on the right.
I think that's true. We're liberated enough, would be one point. Certainly in the developed West, we're liberated enough, and we probably all need to take a freedom haircut. But also, as well as taking a freedom haircut, we need to go outside.
All right. Mary Harrington, thank you for coming to Budapest to spend time with us, and thank you all for coming out today. I'm Rod Dreher. Thanks again.